This is Stafford in the centre of England. Stafford town centre is almost an island, surrounded by the River Sow and marshes. At the south was the ford that gives the town its name. Now there's a bridge. At the north end was the only dry road in. The old town preserves its ancient shape, a circle and cross. There are fragments of town walls. Though a lot was lost in the 1960s and the post-war desire for the bright and new, Stafford has an unusual amount of historic buildings. But at the centre of town is the oldest, St Chad's Church. It's opposite the Swan Hotel, once a tip-top coaching inn before the railways. St Chad's is a gateway into mystery, universal mysteries, and it's there for everyone who steps off the street. These stones were quarried a few miles to the east at Tixall. They would have been carved there in situ by the stonemasons who planned the building. This isn't local folk art. The masons travelled round Europe gathering new ideas. There was a Herefordshire school who built extravagantly decorated churches with strange and bizarre creatures such as at Kilpeck, and some features can be found all through the Norman world, along the pilgrim's route to Compostela, like these beakheads. But St Chad's has some things of its own. Who are these people? The church was built in the mid-12th century, 1140 at the earliest. It would have been the biggest building in a small town, standing beside the road that ran through the county from north to south, at the centre of this island surrounded by river and marsh. We know who built it. It was a man called Orm. It's the Norse word for serpent or dragon, but by the 12th century it was a Saxon name. There's an inscription, "He was called Orm who built me," and there are serpents all round the church. There are no records of the church in its early centuries, but there was an important and powerful Orm. He was the son of Richard Chenven, known as Richard the Forester, the powerful guardian of the royal forest, now Cannock Chase. Richard is a French name, but Orm's Saxon. Some say Richard was a Norman knight and Orm's mother a Saxon heiress. By the time the church was built, Orm possessed manors from the far north of the county, Biddulph, running south through Chatterley, Chell and Clayton, Darlaston near Stone, he's sometimes called Orm of Darlaston, through Rodbaston and Essington near Cannock. Orm married, some say, the daughter of Nicholas, Lord of Stafford Castle. Stafford would have been at the centre of his Staffordshire lands. After Orm's death, the manors were divided between his sons. His granddaughter Aline of Darlaston recorded them in 1189. She was the first patron of Biddulph Church. Orm's heirs were Staffordshire landowners for centuries. Oakover Hall is still owned by descendants of Orm's son Ralph Fitz-Orm. St Chad's was an important statement, the centre of Orm's domain on an important road. It would have been built by the finest travelling craftsmen and expressed the newest ideas. What do these stones mean? We have to forget the 20th century idea of green men. The idea that these faces sprouting greenery were pagan symbols goes back no further than 1939, an article by Lady Raglan in the journal Folklore, The Green Man in Church Architecture. Before that, a green man was only ever a quite different figure dressed in greenery seen on pub signs. The foliate head, as it's called, is something that goes back to Roman times as a symbol of nature and fecundity, but it reappears in Norman churches. What did it mean in a 12th century church? Often with many other carvings of nature, strange or comical. Sometimes these heads represent Adam. There was a medieval legend that the tree of life grew from a seed Adam had eaten, springing from his skull. That can be seen at Kilpeck. But all this nature springing from stone in the mid-12th century, what does it mean? What did nature mean in Orm's time? There's a story that these carvings were made by Saracens brought to England by St Chad's founder Orm during the Crusades. They lived on Biddulph Moor, one of Orm's lands in the north of Staffordshire, and were known as the Biddulph Moormen. These strange figures on the Great Arch might be those Saracens themselves. But this is probably a Victorian fantasy. The story of the Saracens first appears in a wonderful book, Memorials of Old Staffordshire, published in 1909, edited by William Beresford, who had been the vicar of St Chad's from 1875 to 1882, when he moved to St Luke's, Leek. It's a book full of interesting anecdotes. You have to love a book that has a chapter called Some Local Fairies. The St Chad story appears in the chapter called Extracts from Notes of a Tour in Staffordshire by Miss Paulina Biddulph. Paulina travelled round the country by pony and trap some years ago, she says. She says there's an old tale that the people on Biddulph Moor were descended from 7 Saracens. They were famous as stonemasons. They were handsome, shy, fair folk of middle height, and amongst the children, she says, are seen the most lovely shades of red gold hair. She says no one connected them with St Chad's or knew who Orm was, but Paulina had seen the inscription in the church, which is illustrated in the book. Paulina's father was a wealthy banker named Orm of Biddulph. He was a banker in Chester, but the family came from London. The family must have known about the original Orm, who could easily have been their ancestor. Paulina published a very short novel, Joyce, in 1877. When she made her tour, she'd been living in Tipton in the Black Country. Perhaps it was her only visit to the land of her ancestor. It seems that it was Paulina who invented the story of Saracen stonemasons inspired by the newly restored St Chad's. The idea there were people on Biddulph Moor descended from Saracens is a little older. Slee, in his History of the Ancient Parish of Leek in 1862, says they were descended from a Saracen brought over by one of the lords of Biddulph, who made him his bailiff. Slee doesn't mention Orm. The bailiff's descendants became the Bailey family. There was a Bailey family on Biddulph Moor, as Samuel Bailey was leader of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in the 1850s, but a family tree on ancestry.co.uk traces them back to Wiltshire in the 17th century. S.A.H. Byrne, in the 1909 Transactions of the North Staffs Field Club, says she visited the Biddulph Moor folk in 1893. Her version of the story is that they were descended from 12 Saracen captives brought back by the Lord of Knipersley, who would have been Orm, but she makes no mention of stonemasons. There might be something in the story of the Saracens of Biddulph, though it's not recorded before 1862. But the idea they were the stonemasons of St Chad's seems to have been invented by Paulina Biddulph. In which case, who are these figures on the arch? They're unique to St Chad's. There's an answer in a carving just above them. Above the arch on the south side, this small man standing over a giant's head. Anyone in the 12th century would have identified this as David standing over the head of Goliath. The book of Samuel tells the story. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. He stood upon the Philistine, and cut off his head. This is the victorious David. So these must be the defeated Philistines, and they mark the arch which separates the nave from the choir and chancel. They flee in astonishment at the death of Goliath, and perhaps they are astonished by the mysteries within. St Chad's was built in the second half of the 12th century, perhaps as early as the 1140s. This was a time of new ideas of nature. In the mid-12th century, when this church was built, thinkers at Chartres began to wonder how nature could tell us about God. Just as St Chad's was being built, a follower of the school of Chartres, Bernard Sylvester, wrote his Cosmographia, a book about creation, a fanciful and complicated allegory. And the heroine of his story is Natura, nature. She isn't what we think of nature today, the living things of earth. She is the nature who gives order to the physical world, God's agent, helping the trees, animals, and us to form, to become what God wants them to be. This is how the people who built these Norman churches thought about nature. In Bernard's story, at the beginning, all there is in this world is something called matter. It's almost nothing, shapeless, chaotic. The Latin word for matter is silver, which also means wood. This is why medieval storytellers see woods and forests as images of dark, unknown, formless matter, places for adventure. Silver, matter, cries out to be made into something beautiful, to be closer to God. Nature hears the cry and pleads with God to give matter form and beauty. Nature's sister Urania is pure harmony, the harmony that turns the stars and planets. Urania says nature can take the harmony and beauty from the stars and use it to give meaning and beauty to poor, shapeless silver. Nature travels down through the celestial spheres, gathering the beauty and harmony from the planets. This scene inspired the spirits of the planets in C.S. Lewis's science fiction novels. Nature gives the gifts of the planets to silver, who can then grow towards God, seeking beauty and meaning. And the same harmony is then given to human beings who are made of matter but have the souls that are copies of Urania's beautiful cosmos. This is a poetic story, but it's how the medieval mind saw creation, the material world at the centre, seeking beauty, the celestial spheres, which are harmony, and beyond those, the angels and God. Now we can see the stone of these Norman churches in a new way. These carvings are silver, matter, the stone itself seeking God. All creation seeks God, and can reveal God. This might be a deer on Cannock Chase. There are dragons too, and I like this face. It's above the organ. It looks inspired, seeking harmony. Izaak Walton was born in St Chad's Parish in 1593. For some reason he was baptised in St Mary's, but St Chad's was his church. It was important to him throughout his life. Walton is remembered for his complete angler, but he was a hugely important figure in English culture. His book inspired the English desire to get back to nature, to make natural gardens, to care for the environment. In his lifetime, Walton gave £22 to build a stone wall about St Chad's graveyard. It was later replaced by iron rails, but those have gone now. There was a relic of the Middle Ages in the churchyard, the base of a cross. Very unusually, this has an inscription, partly lost. What the forbidden fruit fatal did for man, the blood undid, which from Christ's body ran. In 1672, Izaak Walton gave his garden and all its appurtenances in Stafford for the poor, and if his charity was not properly bestowed by the corporation, he said, it should go to the church wardens of St Chad's. But by the 1850s, the church had fallen into a state of almost complete dilapidation. 4 of the 6 bells had been sold in 1750. 2 remain. The one that's still rung is dated 1632. It has a Latin inscription often found on early 17th century bells. Sum rosa pulsata mundi Maria vocata. I am the rose of the world when rung, being called Maria. A 14th century Sanctus bell can be seen in the church. The outer aisles had been demolished in the early 17th century. The west end collapsed in 1740 and a plain brick wall was built to replace it. The west end was hidden by shops well into the 19th century. The state of the church wasn't helped by the fact that the tithe income of the parish went to the prebend of Prees, Canon Henry Ryder, in the 19th century, with the curate running the church, funded by the Earl of Shrewsbury. It was only after the prebend's death that a paid vicar could be appointed by the bishop. On May the 25th, 1853, the Staffordshire Advertiser reported that the church was to be restored in memory of Izaak Walton. The project was to be, it said, a fitting memorial in the place of his birth to one who, as an author, is of imperishable fame, as a man is an honour to the English character, and as a member of the church, a pattern to every English layman. The project was led by local banker Thomas Salt. Already there were donations from the church and all the local aristocracy and dignitaries. The interior of the church, including the arch and the ceiling, had been plastered over. Where the side aisles had been, the arches had been bricked up with windows. The extraordinary carvings re-emerged from the plaster. Some of the carvings on the arch, hidden by the old pulpit, were in perfect condition, others were restored. A new font in Norman style was added. The reopening of the church by the bishop was reported in the Staffordshire Advertiser on August 2nd, 1856. Work continued for many years. The notorious church restorer George Gilbert Scott added a new west end in imitation Norman style. In 1874, a statue of St Chad was installed there. This caused controversy. It was seen as popish by some. The nave was restored in memory of Thomas Salt, who began the restoration, and the north aisle rebuilt in 1880. By 1882, the tower was in a bad state and new funds were raised to restore it, led by the vicar William Beresford. In the 20th century, the church began to be decorated to suit Anglo-Catholic forms of worship. The reredos, in 15th century style, was designed by Sir Walter Tapper in 1910. Charles Nicholson made an elaborate font cover in medieval style in 1935. Nicholson also made the choir stalls. They have some nice details, possibly inspired by M.R. James' ghost stories. The rood beam is also by Nicholson, and the figures of Christ, Mary and John are by the Italian woodcarver Guglielmo Tosi, who carved similar ones at Wells Cathedral. Any church before the Reformation would have had a place for Mary, Mother of God. There are several images of the Virgin at St. Chad's, but perhaps the most striking is a copy of a statue by Henri Bourrichet, originally carved in 1860 for the seminary at Angers, called Mary, Queen of the Sciences. It's a modern equivalent of the medieval image of Mary as Queen of the Seven Liberal Arts. This statue came from Christchurch Jail Square, demolished when the roundabout at the north end of town was built. After centuries of neglect, St. Chad's had regained the colour and mystery it would have had in the Middle Ages, and a style of worship to match. The most recent additions to the imagery of St. Chad's Church are the west windows, designed by David Williams. These bring new light to the ancient stones, and they affirm the theme of nature that's there in the old carvings and the association with Izaak Walton. There's St. Chad walking through his diocese as he did, perhaps on the old path to Lichfield that's now part of the Two Saints' Way. On either side are the Tree of Life and the River of Life. These can be seen as simply bright lights from the natural world shining towards the mysteries beyond this world at the East End, but they might have other poetic and visionary meanings. St. Chad's Church was more than 200 years old when the anonymous poet wrote his masterpieces Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl. The poet wrote in a South Cheshire or North Staffordshire dialect, and Gawain seems to be set partly in the Dane Valley in the north of the county, but the poet writes of it as a wild and strange place, not as his home. He knew the area, but did he live further south? Could Gawain and the Green Knight have been performed at one of Richard II's spectacular Christmas celebrations at Lichfield in the 1390s? It's Christmas at Camelot. A green knight on a green horse appears and challenges the knights to cut off his head. Gawain does so. The knight picks up his head and challenges Gawain to a return blow in a year's time. St. Chad's was on the road through the descendants of Orm's domains from the north to Lichfield. Could the poet have seen this and remembered the old stories of beheading contests? It was the companion poem Pearl which inspired the west windows. The two poems are very different, Gawain rough and ready in Old English style, Pearl exquisitely formed, but both have 101 verses. Mary is at the centre of both. Gawain's shield has a pentangle on the front, the joys of Mary, the endless knot and other things, and on the inside, so he can always see it in battle, a painting of Mary. In Pearl, Mary is the Queen of Heaven, where even the child Pearl is a queen. The poet visits Pearl's grave at Lammas. She died very young. He dreams he's by a clear flowing river and sees a beautiful figure in white wearing a crown of pearls on the other side. She died as a child, but now she appears as she truly is. He follows her uphill to the water's head and sees the heavenly city where she lives, as St. John describes it, with its layers of coloured jewels and its river which flows down with the trees of life on either side. I like to imagine the River Sau is an aspect of that river, flowing from the holy city which the poet saw at the water's head. Could the vision have been at the watershed of the Sau, near Broughton and Fair Oak, the county border, the furthest point to the west in England where water is flowing east, bringing the new life and light of the city into our world, renewing nature, and all the trees along its course are the trees of life with their fruit for each month of the year and leaves for the healing of the nations.